One parade. 3 days later, every hospital bed in Philadelphia was full. Weeks later, thousands were dead. Not because of bombs, not because of bullets, but because death had already joined the crowd, hiding behind applause, handshakes, and patriotic cheers. This is the story of the deadliest pandemic of the 20th century and the day one city unknowingly invited it in. On a bright September day in 1918, Philadelphia did something that, in hindsight, feels almost impossible to watch. It held a parade. Not a small one, not a cautious one, a massive patriotic procession. More than 200,000 people flooded Broad Street under banners, brass music, and the feverish optimism of a nation desperate to believe the worst was behind it. America was still fighting in the First World War. The city wanted triumph. It wanted spectacle. It wanted noise loud enough to drown out the rumors already moving east from military camps and Atlantic ports. Somewhere in that crowd, a child sits on his father's shoulders. A nurse on her day off claps as a regiment passes by. A pregnant woman shifts her weight in the crush of bodies. A street vendor takes coins from hands he doesn't know. A sailor coughs once into the sleeve. No one notices. And that is the most terrifying part. Because history rarely announces the moment everything changes. It whispers first. Then, within 72 hours, every bed in Philadelphia's 31 hospitals is full. The brass bands are gone now. In their place, ambulance sirens, church bells, the thick, wet sound of men trying to breathe through lungs that are drowning from the inside. Doctors move so quickly that sleep becomes a rumor. Nurses pin masks over their faces and keep going until their hands shake. Undertakers run out of caskets. Morgues overflow. Families begin burying their own dead because there is no one left to help them. In the week ending October 5th, roughly 2,600 people in Philadelphia die from influenza or its complications. A week later, that number rises above 4,500. The city shuts schools, churches, theaters, pool halls, but it is already too late. Witnesses will describe bodies stacked like cordwood. And still, this catastrophe will later be forgotten by millions. Not because it was small, not because it was unclear, but because it arrived during a world war, killed faster than artillery, and then slipped into the margins of memory as if the dead had never screamed. Map: Atlantic world in 1918. Shipping routes glow across oceans. This is the story of the pandemic that infected around 1/3 of humanity, killed at least 50 million people, possibly far more, and struck down not only the very young and the elderly, but healthy adults in the prime of life, men and women in their 20s and 30s, soldiers, mothers, workers, doctors, presidents. They called it the Spanish flu. But Spain did not create it. And if you want to understand why this pandemic became one of the deadliest events in human history, you have to begin with a question much darker than disease. What happens when a virus collides with war, censorship, pride, and the human refusal to stop living even when death is already in the crowd? The first wave did not arrive like an apocalypse. That is what made it so dangerous. In early 1918, in the final year of the First World War, reports began surfacing of a strange influenza moving through military camps. One of the earliest documented outbreaks in the United States appeared in March at Camp Funston, Fort Riley, Kansas. Soldiers fell sick fast, fever, body aches, weakness, coughing, but many recovered. It was ugly, yes, but not yet mythic. In any other year, it might have remained a grim but manageable military illness. But 1918 was not any other year. Europe was still eating young men by the millions. Troop ships crossed the Atlantic in constant rotation. Trains stitched together camps, factories, cities, and ports. Armies moved like conveyor belts for microbes. And a virus doesn't care whether it is being carried in a farmer, a dock worker, or a soldier on his way to the trenches. The disease spread with the logic of modernity itself: faster travel, denser populations, industrial war. In camp after camp, ship after ship, men lived pressed together in bunks, mess halls, transport lines, and hospital wards. Perfect conditions. Not just for transmission, but for evolution. So why Spanish flu? Because Spain, unlike many nations at war, had a relatively free press. In France, Britain, Germany, and the United States, wartime censorship shaped headlines. Governments feared panic. They feared weakened morale. They feared anything that could be interpreted as vulnerability. Spain, neutral in the war, reported openly on the epidemic, including cases affecting high-profile figures like King Alfonso XIII. To the outside world, it looked like Spain had the problem. It didn't. Spain simply talked about it. That single branding error would become one of the most enduring lies in modern history. The first wave moved across the globe in the spring of 1918. Real, disruptive, contagious, but not yet the version that would scar civilization. Then, somewhere between movement, mutation, and mass exposure, something changed. The virus came back. And when it came back with teeth. By late summer and early autumn, the virus re-emerged in a far deadlier form. Boston, Brest, Freetown. Military and port cities lit up like signal fires. The second wave spread globally roughly September to November 1918, and this was the wave people would remember, if they dared remember it at all. The speed was unnatural. Patients who seemed merely ill in the morning could be dead by nightfall. Influenza itself was bad enough: high fevers, exhaustion, brutal coughing. But what followed was often worse: secondary bacterial pneumonia, lungs filling, skin darkening, oxygen vanishing from the blood. Doctors watched faces turn blue. Not metaphorically, literally. A physician at Camp Devens, Massachusetts, wrote one of the most haunting letters of the pandemic. He described young soldiers arriving with what looked like ordinary influenza, then rapidly developing the most vicious type of pneumonia. 2 hours at admission, he wrote, they showed mahogany spots over the cheekbones. Then cyanosis spread from the ears across the face, until, in his words, it became hard to distinguish black soldiers from white. After that, it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. He called it horrible. He said the men were dropping like flies. He said they were averaging about 100 deaths per day. He described special trains carrying away the dead, the shortage of coffins, the morgue overflowing into a barracks lined with bodies in double rows. He wrote it looked worse than anything seen in France after battle. Think about that. A war doctor looked at an American hospital and said it looked worse than the front. And here is where the psychological terror deepens. This was not mainly killing the frail. The 1918 pandemic produced a mortality pattern so unusual that epidemiologists still talk about it in almost reverent tones. Seasonal influenza usually kills in a U-shaped curve, the very young and the very old. The 1918 virus formed a W-shaped curve. There was the familiar suffering of infants and the elderly, but now there was a third spike, a brutal concentration of death among healthy young adults, roughly ages 20 to 40. The very people most expected to survive were dying. The people with the strongest lungs, the hardest bodies, the most active immune systems. Theories would come later about immune overreaction, about cytokine storms, about the role of bacterial co-infection and wartime stress. But for those living through it, explanation lagged behind fear. All they knew was that this disease selected people who were not supposed to die. A mother could survive while her grown son suffocated. A grandfather could endure while a nurse collapsed on shift. A regiment of strong young men could be reduced to corpses in a week. It violated the basic contract people thought they had with nature. Be strong and you live. Not this time. The virus had found the age of industry, mass war, and patriotic crowding, and humanity, proud of its machines and armies, discovered it could still be brought to its knees by something invisible. Philadelphia is often remembered now as a warning, but warnings only become obvious after the disaster. At the time, city officials faced conflicting pressures: war mobilization, public morale, financial campaigns, and the uneasy awareness that influenza had already been detected nearby. Doctors and health officials debated what to do. Some urged caution, others hesitated. The Liberty Loan Parade, a major war bond event, remained on the schedule. So the city marched. It is easy from a distance of a century to mock them, to ask how they could have done something so reckless, but that would miss the real lesson. They did it because they were human. Because closing things feels like surrender. Because danger that cannot be seen does not feel fully real. Because war had already normalized death on a scale that distorted judgment. Because patriotic theater is intoxicating. Because people wanted to believe the officials who reassured them. Because the alternative, canceling, retreating, admitting loss of control, was politically and psychologically unbearable. That is how disaster usually works. Not through cartoon villainy, through hesitation, rationalization, pressure, pride. Within 3 days, every hospital bed in the city is occupied. Doctors run out of space, out of time, out of language for what they're seeing. Public institutions begin to fail all at once. Hospitals are crippled by staffing shortages. Many medical professionals are already away in military service. Undertakers can't keep up. Morgues overflow. Families call for help that never arrives. The city closes schools, churches, theaters, and public spaces on October 3rd, but epidemics are merciless accountants. Delay is debt, and debt compounds.
By then, the curve is already rising toward catastrophe. This is one of the central ironies of the 1918 pandemic. Governments had very few pharmaceutical tools. There was no flu vaccine. Antibiotics did not yet exist to treat the bacterial pneumonias that often turned influenza into a death sentence. So the most powerful weapons available were the simplest and most socially painful. Isolate the sick, ban gatherings, close institutions, reduce contact. Measures that seem humble. Measures people almost always underestimate. Measures that work best before fear makes them politically obvious. Philadelphia learned too late. And while Philadelphia buried its dead, another American city wrote a different chapter. St. Louis did not have better medicine than Philadelphia. It had something rarer. It had time, and a health commissioner willing to use it. Dr. Max Starkloff watched the epidemic moving westward from Boston and understood what many others preferred not to say aloud. Influenza was coming, and if the city waited until the danger looked undeniable, it would already be trapped inside the math of exponential spread. so St. Louis acted early. On October 8th, theaters, movie houses, pool halls, and other public amusement venues were ordered closed. Public gatherings were banned. Schools followed on October 9th. Churches were closed. Business restrictions came later. At one point, downtown operating hours were limited. In November, when conditions worsened again, a 4-day shutdown of non-essential stores, businesses, and factories was imposed. Children were barred from public places when officials saw how heavily the epidemic was hitting the young. This was not neat. It was not universally popular. Business leaders resisted. Religious voices protested. Economic hardship was immediate. Confusion was real. But the city kept adjusting. Not perfectly, no city did, but decisively. The result became one of the most famous natural experiments in public health history. St. Louis ultimately recorded one of the lowest excess death rates among major American cities, about 358 per 100,000 people, far below the devastation seen in places that moved later. 2 American cities, same virus, same era, same lack of vaccine, same lack of antibiotics. Different timing, different political will, different death toll. There is something almost unbearable in that comparison, because it suggests that many thousands who died in 1918 were not only victims of a virus, they were victims of delay.
Victims of gatherings that did not need to happen. Victims of leaders who waited for certainty in a crisis that punished waiting. Victims of the ancient fantasy that normal life can be defended by pretending the emergency has not arrived. And yet even St. Louis, for all its relative success, did not escape. No city truly escaped. The virus was too widespread, the world too entangled, the war too large. This was never a story about perfect safety, only about whether civilization could lower the blade before it fell. When people picture the 1918 pandemic, they often imagine a primarily American or European tragedy. It wasn't. This was a planetary event, one of the first truly global catastrophes of the modern age. Roughly 500 million people, about 1/3 of the world's population at the time, were infected. The death toll is commonly estimated at around 50 million. Some scholarship argues it may have been closer to 100 million. That upper estimate is almost too large to process. So let's translate it into human terms. It means villages emptied, factories slowed, orphanhood exploded, postal routes carried condolence letters as routinely as bills, farm work vanished because whole households were sick at once. Funeral rituals collapsed under volume. In some places, the living stepped around the dead because grief itself had become logistically overwhelmed. India was especially devastated. So were parts of Africa, the Pacific, and regions already weakened by malnutrition, war strain, colonial extraction, and medical inequality. The pandemic moved across lines of empire the way fire runs through dry timber. In Europe, it stalked trenches, rail depots, and demobilizing armies. In communities already gutted by 4 years of war, influenza arrived not as a separate trauma, but as an extension of the same nightmare. Families who had survived artillery and starvation now opened the door to another messenger of death. And because this was influenza, it wore a deceptive mask. It could look ordinary at first: fever, weakness, cough, familiar symptoms in an age accustomed to respiratory disease. Then, hours later, lungs would fail. That is one reason the terror spread so effectively. People were not confronting a monster that looked monstrous from the beginning. They were confronting something intimate, something that entered through kitchens, bunkhouses, barracks, wedding gatherings, religious services, and tram rides. War had already taught the world to expect death from above: shells, bullets, gas. The flu taught people to fear the breath beside them. And what makes breath terrifying is that it cannot be fully policed. You can guard a border, you can censor a newspaper, you can arrest a dissenter, but you cannot command a virus to respect patriotic speeches, military priorities, or economic schedules. This was the humiliation hidden inside the pandemic. Modern states could mobilize millions of men, build machines of industrial slaughter, and redraw maps across continents, but they could not stop a cough in a crowd. Every pandemic reveals biology, but it also reveals power. Who is allowed to speak? Who delays action? Who benefits from calm? Who pays for it? In 1918, wartime censorship and patriotic messaging helped create the illusion that the disease was more foreign, more distant, and more manageable than it really was. In many countries, downplaying illness was not a side effect of politics. It was politics. Governments feared panic because panic threatened war production, military movement, bond drives, and morale. Newspapers often softened language. Officials issued reassurances. Entire societies tried to continue functioning as if public acknowledgement itself were more dangerous than the pathogen. And when evidence became undeniable, the change in tone was often abrupt and chaotic. This is one of the grimmest patterns in history. Institutions often spend the earliest, most valuable phase of a crisis protecting confidence rather than protecting life. By the time confidence collapses, the opportunity has already gone. Even leaders at the very top were not immune. In 1919, during the Paris Peace Conference, President Woodrow Wilson fell ill with influenza. Historians still debate how much his condition may have affected his stamina, clarity, and negotiating capacity during a critical moment in shaping the post-war order. What matters here is not one speculative counterfactual, it is the scale of the intrusion. The pandemic reached into the rooms where nations were being redesigned. It sat, invisible, beside men discussing the future of the world. That detail matters because it destroys the comforting idea that pandemics belong only to the poor, the crowded, or the lucky. Those groups suffer first and worst, yes, but influenza crossed class, rank, and office alike. And still, despite all this, the pandemic would later live in the shadow of the war. Why? Because wars produce heroes, villains, borders, medals, monuments. Pandemics produce absences. A war gives history a plot. A pandemic gives it millions of unfinished sentences. No final battle, no surrender ceremony, no triumphant photograph that closes the pain. Just empty beds, closed eyes, and households permanently rearranged. That makes a pandemic harder to mythologize and easier to forget. One of the most chilling mysteries of 1918 was not merely that so many died, it was who died. Healthy young adults, people between roughly 20 and 40, should not have formed such a prominent ridge in the mortality curve. Yet they did. The 1918 pattern was so strange, it still defines the pandemic in scientific literature. A W-shaped mortality curve, not the expected U. Why? The full answer is still not simple.
Some researchers point to an over-aggressive immune response, what later generations would call a cytokine storm, where the body's own defenses become part of the destruction. Others emphasize the deadly role of bacterial pneumonia at a time before antibiotics. Many victims likely survived the initial viral assault only to be overwhelmed by secondary infections. Crowded barracks, soot-filled cities, wartime stress, prior illness, limited supportive care all sharpened the blade. In other words, the virus did not kill alone. It worked with circumstance, with overcrowding, with medicine's limitations, with the chemistry of wartime exhaustion, with the fact that entire societies had been thinned by deprivation. And there is a psychological darkness in that too. We prefer singular villains, one cause, one monster, one fix. But the Spanish flu became catastrophic because biology fused with systems. A mutating virus met troop transport, crowding met censorship, pneumonia met the pre-antibiotic era, public gatherings met delayed intervention, and youth itself, normally a shield, became in some cases part of the vulnerability. That is why this story feels so modern, not because history repeats mechanically, but because the deepest danger often comes not from one failure, but from many ordinary failures aligning at once. By the time people recognized the scale of the threat, the machinery was already turning. The second wave was the most infamous, but it was not the end. A third wave followed in many places during the winter and early months of 1919. The dead kept coming. Communities that thought they had endured the worst were forced to reopen mass graves of fear. Just when normalcy seemed possible, the virus returned to remind people that epidemics do not obey emotional timelines. And then, gradually, it receded. Not in one cinematic moment, not with a declaration, not with global relief synchronized to a single date. It weakened unevenly, place by place, wave by wave, until absence stopped growing fast enough to dominate the front page. The world exhaled. Then it looked away. Part of that forgetting was practical. Populations were exhausted. The Great War had just ended in November 1918. Nations were dealing with peace treaties, revolutions, veterans, debt, and reconstruction. Families that had lost sons to trenches and daughters to fever often carried both griefs at once. Public memory chose the war because the war had architecture, battlefields, anniversaries, monuments, names carved in stone. The flu had kitchens where chairs stayed empty. It had letters never answered, wages never earned, children who grew up with a gap in the household and no statue to explain it. And so, the dead of the pandemic slipped into a quieter category of mourning, no less painful, just less theatrical, less useful for national myth. But forgetting did not mean the event was small. It meant the event was intimate beyond language. This may be the cruelest paradox of all. The larger the tragedy, the harder it can become to hold in memory when it leaves behind no single battlefield, no single villain, no single day history teachers can circle in red. The 1918 flu killed in bedrooms, barracks, wards, and boarding houses. It shattered lungs, not city walls. It drowned people where they slept. And because of that, it became one of the most devastating and least emotionally integrated catastrophes of the modern world. Go back to Philadelphia for a moment. Back to the brass music, back to the flags, back to the sunlight on uniforms, back to the crowd that did not know it was standing inside a future obituary.
That image endures because it contains everything: hope and denial, patriotism and pressure, normal life and invisible danger, the human urge to gather even when gathering may destroy us. The 1918 pandemic was not forgotten because it lacked horror. It was forgotten because its horror was too distributed, too domestic, too unspectacular in its mechanics. No invasion, no coup, no single mastermind. Just a virus exploiting every weakness in human systems and every weakness in human psychology. We wait, we doubt, we bargain. We tell ourselves one more event is harmless. We assume strength guarantees survival. We protect confidence until confidence kills. And then afterward, we act surprised that history has visited the same lesson again. The 1918 flu should have become one of the central stories of the 20th century. Instead, it became a ghost behind larger, louder events. Yet its fingerprints are everywhere, in public health theory, in emergency planning, in the study of viral evolution, in the grim mathematics of early intervention, in the knowledge that a city's fate can pivot on a few lost days. And maybe that is why this story still unsettles us more than a century later. Because unlike a war, a pandemic forces a civilization to confront itself, not just its medicine, its character. Do we act early when action feels extreme? Do we tell the truth before truth becomes expensive? Do we accept temporary sacrifice to prevent mass death? Do we understand that invisible threats do not become less real because they are inconvenient? The people of 1918 did not lack intelligence, they lacked certainty in time. And uncertainty in moments like these is precisely where catastrophe breeds. Somewhere in Philadelphia, after the cheering stopped, someone opened a window to let in October air and heard wagon wheels below. Somewhere in Camp Devens, a doctor finished another shift and realized he was no longer shocked by rows of dead boys. Somewhere in St. Louis, officials signed closure orders knowing they would be hated for it, and did it anyway. Somewhere across the world, in a village without headlines, a mother buried the strongest person in her family and never learned why this sickness chose him. That is the true scale of the Spanish flu, not merely in statistics, but in the collapse of assumptions. That the young would live, that war was the greatest threat, that modernity meant control, that governments would tell the truth quickly, that society could always outrun biology. It couldn't. And that is why the pandemic of 1918 is not only a story about the past, it is a story about the fragile line between warning and action. A story about what happens when the world keeps marching because stopping feels impossible. A story about a forgotten plague that killed more than World War I and left behind a question every generation thinks it can answer better than the last. When the next invisible storm gathers, will we recognize it before the music starts?